Welcome to the Reconstructing Inclusion podcast. My name is Amri Johnson, your host. Season 3 of the Reconstructing Inclusion podcast will be focused on opening up dialogue about a way forward in the diversity and inclusion space that's focused more on who we are than what we ascribe to one another. It will be about shifting patterns and practices we've come to adhere to in the space, examining them with fresh eyes in the current climate, about principles the work has revolved around, and why and what principles we might need to consider anew, about exploring our thinking, how we are making meaning of our workplaces and the world around us in the most curious ways we can, how we listen with skill, openly learn, create the conditions that allow colleagues to know they matter. Hey folks, Amri here. I hope you're well. I've been on the road, which is a good thing given 2025, because DEI has taken a beating. And if I've been on the road, that means I'm working. It's optimistic. Obviously, that DEI has taken a hit in 2025 is not news to anyone, but something interesting is emerging from the wreckage, both for Inclusion Wins, my company, and for the field more broadly. I'm starting to see traction again, though maybe not as much in the US yet, but I'm seeing it in other parts of the world where we've been putting more of our attention. But the damaging hit we took, I think it's turning, but it's going a little bit differently than I think many expect. Today, I want to share some random thoughts on 3 things. First, why I wish my articles got more pushback. I wish more people read them, and then more people in the space actually push back on them, and how the DEI community has failed at genuine debate. Second, a story about my son that reframed everything for me. And third, where I think this space is heading over the next 12 to even 18 months. Last week at bedtime, my 6-year-old son, Kai, was all over the place, which isn't necessarily unusual, but he just couldn't bring himself completely down. So he was looking for this thing and this other stuffed animal. He just couldn't stop himself. I asked him to chill, bro. He uses bro a lot now. So I said, chill, bro. But he was not chilling. So I yelled. I'm not proud of my yelling, but I'm a parent. It happened. And he got settled. But then he looked at me. He got real close to my face and he said, Daddy, this is just a dream. My mind was like, what? Like, this 6-year-old child saying this to me. My mind immediately went to the philosophers who used that metaphor. Zhuangzi, the Daoist philosopher who was heavily influenced by the philosophy of Lao Tzu, or the source of Lao Tzu's philosophy, famously asked, was it a butterfly? And he talks about a dream he was having. Was it a butterfly dreaming it was Zhuangzi, or was it Zhuangzi dreaming about a butterfly? He couldn't make the distinction. The point being that it's sometimes hard for us to distinguish what we're creating and what world we're creating and the dream we're living in. It's not a creation done by one. It's a co-creation, in this case, between Zhuangzi and the butterfly. We're co-creating all the time. And so as practitioners in this space, it's likely that we've been co-creating the current conditions. That's not necessarily easy to listen to or to hear, but it's important. Now, I just returned from the LEAD 2025 conference in Milan, Italy. I was energized in ways I haven't been for months. I was on stage talking about mattering. This conference has been running for 27 years, focused on fast-moving consumer goods, CPG space. And people were so open. It was amazing. I talked again about the construct of mattering, what it can mean to organizations right now. And the group got it. They got it palpably. And that was what I was dreaming about. And somehow in the moment, we dreamt it together. It gave me a different level of hope. This notion of DEI as dream has been consuming me since my son's conversation, and actually way before. I made the prediction of the current state subtly in Reconstructing Inclusion. and I've been quite loudly writing about it and speaking about it since. DEI, as many have framed it, practice it, has created the likelihood of it becoming untenable. As a combination of letters, theoretically and pragmatically, we might have driven it into being obsolete. Not the principle, so get clear about that, not the foundation of what this work is, not what we want to do at the heart of it. And I'm not just talking about the paradigms of civil rights and social justice. I'm talking about an understanding that this creates the conditions for everyone to make their best contribution to the organization, for all the mixtures of diversity, even those that don't include human diversity, to really be a tangible way that we move forward and make organizational progress. I don't think we've driven DEI to being obsolete when it comes to principles, when it comes to the foundation, not when it comes to the heart of what we would like it to be. But the letters themselves, they're just symbols, they're representations. They're not the thing. That's another philosophical construct. For example, if I rip out the pages of a holy text and I tell you to eat them so you can really absorb the Bible, that's silly. You can do it from reading, but there's something inside that connects with that reading. Definitely can't eat them and definitely shouldn't rip pages out. But it's something that comes from inside that connects with what you get on the outside. But it doesn't have anything to do with the scripture by itself. Like the scripture was emanated from the hearts of others. The scriptures are supposed to speak to your heart, so your heart can then put things into practice that are in alignment with it. So I'm not talking about the principles. And these letters, D, E, and I, are not the essence. The essence has been stuffed into these three letters, and it's like writing the word pizza on paper and handing it to you. That's not pizza. You can't ingest that. You can't get the nutrients or deliciousness from it. I think we've gotten there with DEI. So the people that are against DEI are using DEI as something contrary to what I think most people would like to see in the world. And those who are pro DEI are pushing back on them, pushing back on silliness, trying to tell them, no, DEI is good. They're saying, no, DEI is bad. It needs to die. But the reality is nobody wants it to die. If it dies for the anti-DEI folks, they lose their brand. If it dies for the so-called DEI folks, they lose what they think is their passion. But their passion is not that. If DEI should die, and I wrote this in a regular article I'm going to talk about in a second. So I talked about this notion. I had a debate. It was a really awesome debate. This notion of DEI becoming pragmatically obsolete in a debate with one of my dear colleagues, Royanne Ned. Royanne's brilliant. She's a global executive at Oliver Wyman. They invited me to debate the topic, should DEI die? I took the affirmative. Yes, DEI should die. And I wrote a blog about this. If you haven't read it, check it out. Now, listen, when you're on this side of a debate, it's not about your de facto position being right. You know, I talk a lot about rightness not transforming anything, but rather it's about presenting an argument that exposes holes and brings out the best thinking. In my case, the position was DEI should die. Obviously, Royanne came with the opposition, bringing every reason why DEI should stay alive. Here's what got clear to me. I don't want, and I think this is where I think some people that see a clip of me or read one sentence of what I write, I don't want the essence of DEI to die. It would be silly to think that given my firm is called Inclusion Wins. But I guess that would be illogical if people thought that, but I imagine some people do. I'm still writing books in the area. I still have this company. I still publish extensively on the topic. But the reality is, and this may be harsh, people don't read broadly. They don't read things that challenge their narrative as much as they could. There's not enough disconfirmation that people dive into. There's not enough expanding and deepening beyond the construct that's stuck on racialization, gender, and sexuality. That's what it's been. And it's really, really hard for people to break out of it. I believe we can, but it's hard. I was making my case that what DEI once was needs to transition. It's time for DEI to go from its half-dead zombie-like status to a transcendent state of peace. on its way to happiness, as the Peter Tosh song says. I'm on my way to happiness where I can find some peace and rest. Obviously, I don't want people in organizations to stop building the skills and capabilities to create thriving for all employees. And then, of course, for their organizations. I call this whole thing inclusion, defined as any action that creates the conditions for people to thrive in organizations to create extraordinary value, what Umar Haque calls thick value. Obviously, this is beyond profit alone. It's a comprehensive view on what people believe, what communities and societies interdependent with financial capital need. So much of the focus is on ROI. At the conference, a lot of people talked about that. I get it. And it's one of those things big consulting firms put out because they want to continue to sell their services. And some of it's true, but it's incomplete to understand it as this direct impact on EBITDA. Now, there are some things that could be done where representation is concerned, because even though we think meritocracy is based on, whether people are getting into these jobs just because they're the best candidate, like, how do you know? There's so many people out there that have never gotten a chance, so you simply don't know what the meritocracy is. Did somebody have merit? Yeah. Did they have more merit than somebody else? Probably not. There's always somebody that could potentially come in and add something that is different, that something that's outside of what this person knew, in addition to being able to fulfill the role similar to the person that was brought in. People get hired because they know people, not just because they're the best candidate for a role. That is clear. Doesn't mean they're unqualified, but it does mean that they're not always the best that you could get. That's just part of the reason meritocracy remains at the level of myth. But what I want to talk about a little bit more specifically is not just ROI, but maybe if ROI for companies when it comes to inclusion meant return on intangibles, as Dave Ulrich talks about, I could get behind it. And I think others could too, because intangibles do affect the tangible financial stuff. But there are many studies and many articles written showing that when we start doing this return on investment dance, because we're trying to convince people, we're not actually talking to them about the things that are most important and most material, even when it comes to their return on financial investment. There are other things that influence the value of your company, the ability for you to bring in talent and make sure that talent gets the best inputs they can so that they can bring their best value. What I'm talking about could be understood as social capital. It's something I discussed extensively in the Emergent Inclusion Framework. If social capital is not present, if those networks aren't robust, and when I talk about social capital not being present, I'm talking about social capital beyond the bonding type of those that you get on with and that you've known, because that happens all the time in droves. And it's not bad. It just leaves your ability to make impact incomplete in terms of how people come together, even inside of an organization. So I'm talking about social capital in its broadest sense of creating trust and reciprocity across bridges of differences and similarities. If your social capital is not present, I mean, networks aren't robust and there's no trust and reciprocity. I don't care how much financial capital you generate, at some point, there's going to be some type of downswing. This conversation about AI, for example, without social capital, all this AI, machine learning, digital stuff just doesn't get us where we want to be. And I've seen it happen, and some of these companies are seeing it now. All it does when the talk is about almost people being transactional, AI is going to replace them, it becomes about people feeling like they're going to be pushed out, that they don't matter, that they're just cogs in a machine. I hear influential people, CEOs, board leaders, talking about how everyone's going to be replaced by machines that can do it better. In some cases, they might be right, but is that really what you want to communicate to people? We're warning them, we're letting them know, because this is the reality of the future. That's not what you're doing, because we're not there yet. What people need to do to be ready for the future and telling them that they're going to be obsolete, that they're transactions, is not the same. putting that kind of anxiety in people's mindsets and hearts, my goodness, it's absolutely dehumanizing, inhuman, unhelpful. If social capital isn't present, the floors of businesses are hollow and the ceilings are capped. The only change, call it growth if you must, is downward, and it will erode relatively rapidly to the left of zero on a number line. I believe negative returns will come from a lack of social capital. So what's the future look like? What are the 5 shifts that I believe are coming to inclusion work? Let me share somewhat extemporaneously what I see the DEI space going to over the next 12 to 18 months. One, we're going to move beyond the old patterns and paradigms. Beliefs are going to have to shift. The paradigms we've adhered to, the patterns we've focused on, which were really about social justice for some, need to evolve. Social equity has always been at the heart of this work. I've talked about this before, but I've been really diving into where equity started, and no DEI person started it. They just put it in there because I was working in health equity years ago, and it was always about creating the right conditions from social determinants that were universal. They weren't based on somebody's racialization, gender, or sexuality alone. That wasn't the point. The point was that everybody needs this social equity for organizations to thrive, but it became equity for some, focused on systems of inequality in historically marginalized groups. I'm not saying that that was wrong, but that kind of dogged focus becomes almost like you're just advocating for people that you believe are more like you. And I'm not talking about just people that are racialized as more colorful or darker than a lighter brown, or what some people call white, what I would call racialized as white. I'm not talking about this, that we actually pushed down on that so much, even if it was just around a sexuality or gender. It was women. Everybody just was advocating for their group or for that thing that they advocate for. It's increasingly become focused on neurodiversity. All of these things are legitimate. All of them need to be addressed, and everybody needs to get what they need to thrive. But that focus is going away. So what I'm not saying is we're not getting rid of like ERGs, but ERGs need to be in solidarity more. When I was inside of organization as an executive, I spent a lot of time ensuring ERGs weren't focused on a single identity. If they were, they needed significant representation from people who didn't necessarily possess that identity, but were firmly engaged in the work. And they needed to join other ERGs to understand those perspectives and see there's more commonality than the differences we delineate. We're moving towards centering humanity, even in spaces where we're talking about our differences. Understanding that those lines are blurred or in truth don't exist becomes important. Breaking them down and having conversations about how we act in solidarity to help the whole organization is where we're going. It's not the symptoms that are the problem, it's the system. We don't design the system to create the conditions for everyone to thrive. It will never happen. We'll just address more symptoms here and there, get awards for doing so here and there, get recognized as leaders of a particular employee resource group here and there, but it doesn't work. We have to shift beliefs and do something different. So cultural intelligence is going to be a foundation. Higher focus on cultural intelligence. I've worked with the Cultural Intelligence Center in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and David Livermore, one of its founders, for a long time. The emerging research that's coming out around how he talks about power, how our identities shape the way we interact, about time orientation, et cetera, all through the lens of CQ, shows tremendous potential. CQ has always been a foundation of our work as part of the emergent inclusion framework, but it needs to be more of a foundation and foundational part of the approach that organizations and you take to inclusion. It's a set of skills that every single person at every single level can utilize for better ways of engaging each other. The next one is a deeper understanding of care. And I talk about care, openness, safety, and trust. When I talk about care, it's not about the so-called touchy-feely care. It's really about interdependence. And I talk about that a lot, but caring's at the heart of that. Understanding that we're intrinsically connected. When we don't learn to care for each other, we miss the opportunity for everyday mattering to occur. Being able to understand that interdependence means that we can contribute to one another's well-being. When we care for the other, so-called other, to help them fulfill their highest potential, that's how we fulfill our own. Let me say that again. When we care for the so-called other to help them fulfill their highest potential, that's how we fulfill our own highest potential. We need openness. We need willingness to be influenced by the so-called other. We need to create safety, not in the surface sense where everybody's just getting along. That's the psychological safety many think about, which is closer to belongingness. You feel welcome, you feel part of the team, but that doesn't necessarily mean you're a material contributor to the extent that you could be. Real safety means you have agency, you have autonomy. You can throw something out there or push back without negative consequences. It means people feel noticed, they feel affirmed, they feel needed, they feel like they matter, they feel like what they say matters, and that people will act on it unambiguously. Even if it's not the final thing, they're considering it in the making sense of what to be done, what decisions made, and what actions are taken. Safety comes from seeing that hope happen over and over again. And of course, there's trust. The trust that happens when people aren't around each other, not when they're in the room with each other, but when they're apart, when they're representing each other's interests outside the room, when stakes are high, when they've really listened and can represent their colleagues because they care, because they've been open, and because they've been willing to be influenced. Now, I'm going to go to this notion of sense making. There's a new emergence of sense making. I've learned a lot about this over the past few years, particularly from my colleague, Jeff Marlowe, and his excellent Substack. Jeff's Substack is really, it's taught me so much, and he's given references to books that I've read. It's been brilliant. So Jeff talks about the distinction between action taking and decision making. A lot of people in leadership roles feel like they're decision makers. They should be the chief sense makers, in my opinion. They should be the ones not just making the decisions, but how do you engage people to make sense of something before the action is taken? Because oftentimes the decision makers are not the action takers. And if the decision makers, and I saw this when I was inside of a company, and I've seen it as a consultant as well, the decision makers making a decision, the action takers do it. And they're like, man, that was stupid. I'll just do it because they said. That's disempowering. That doesn't mean people matter. It just means that they're part of that machine. You just feed it. That's what an AI can do. But a human makes sense of things. You can't outsource that to AI. So these people that feel like they're decision makers need to become the chief sense makers. And anyone with a decision-making role, even if it's implicit, should become masters at sense making. Building that skill set in ways, in my opinion, that others might not be able to. Only a few would be able to. So they can bring it to the people they lead and help them become better in their leadership too. Peter Drucker said, I quote this constantly, leadership is the capacity of a human community to shape its future. Leadership is fundamentally, largely, about sense-making. Decision-making is fundamentally about sense-making, with the folks impacted by the decisions are those who will take the actions forward. You can't outsource it to a large language model. You can get good questions, but from an AI, but if you're still going to have humans in your organization, which I believe most will, they're still going to need to make sense of things. They can't outsource it to something predicting the next word because you did a certain input. It's not possible. We need to learn to do sense making in a very humanistic, human to human way. The fifth thing is about networks. The future of DEI to me is about networks. It's always been that way, but it's increasingly critical because the connections we're making are now insufficient. The more information we have, the more connection we need with other people, because we're going to be learning, or maybe not even learning, but ingesting information so fast. If we're not transferring that knowledge, that information with care with each other, not just through the machine regurgitating it, but sharing it with each other, bouncing things off each other, so we don't lose our cognitive capacity. We can't outsource that to AI. So we need networks, and this needs to be incentivized, similar to everything that I've said of these last 4 points. We need to design organizational policies to bring people into interactions they otherwise wouldn't have on their own. At the LEAD conference, many people talked about diverse teams, often in terms of visible identity, gender, racialization, sexuality. But what I'm talking about, and what some people did discuss, was cognitive diversity. I heard amazing stories about people who moved from Turkey to Italy to the Nordics, from the Nordics to the UK and Germany. These journeys left them with an experience of seeing the world that someone in the US would have from moving from the South to Chicago, from Chicago to Kansas City, from Kansas City to the Pacific Northwest. Now, obviously, there's legal dynamics and things like that aren't the same in the US, but in terms of CQ capability and cognitive diversity and the way of thinking about engaging with people that have worked at companies in certain regions for a while, there's some adaptability that needs to come through that. And CQ does that. And engaging with people different than you does that. Engaging with people who have a different perspective or different ways of thinking than you does that. So these things create cognitive diversity. All these experiences people have, we need to understand them. And sometimes they're not going to come out explicitly, but we need to even measure these distinctions that all of us have, these combinations, this multidimensionality. You can call it intersectionality if you may. We need to measure it. And that's what my colleagues at Atlas at Cultural Infusion do, which is also part of the emergent inclusion framework. When you take one of our emergent inclusion experiences, you can see everything that's brought people to who they are in ways that you might not be able to. And you can actually talk about that and show that influence and build relationship as a result. So we're able to see where people have developed their identities, at least in part, because identity's critical. It's not going to go away. And the more we build networks of understanding things like identity, understanding the perspectives we bring because of our identity, those are very heavily correlated with cognitive diversity. So you need to think about those collectively, not just cognitive diversity in this more kind of abstract sense. Our diversity of cognition comes from our experiences that come from where we've been, what we've done, how we've done it, and who we've interacted with in the process. It's never a single thing. The diversity in networks and expertise and language and all those dynamics bring new ways of thinking, seeing, being, and doing in organizational life. They're going to become more important than ever before. So let me repeat these 5 areas. 1, moving away from old paradigms of racialization, gender, and sexuality, moving towards principles of centering our humanity and all of its complexity and the tensions that happen when we come together across those mixtures. 2, cultural intelligence. It needs to be on the radar for everyone as a foundational skill set. 3, care, openness, safety, and trust. Relational fitness as central. 4, sense making as an organizational skill or as an inclusion skill superpower. Critical for everybody, particularly those who are de facto implicit or explicit leaders or in leadership at a high level and all across an organization. It should be a fundamental superpower, an inclusion skill that you can make central to your work. And then 5 is social capital and networks to increase connection and cognitive diversity. The question becomes, are we going to stay focused on equity as we've historically talked about it the past few years, equity for representation, or recognize that it's possibly a categorical error? It's about focusing on symptoms instead of systems. We want equity in our systems. We have to build the skill sets, the mindsets, the ways of seeing, being, and doing in organizational life for those to stick. Deal with the system. Otherwise, it's just us pushing a boulder uphill and it keeps coming back down on us. The boulder gets pushed over the mountain together. It doesn't get pushed over by 1 or 2. It gets pushed over. Hear this. It gets pushed over by the many. And that's where I think the space is not just going, but has to go for it to not be retreated into a place of darkness. We can bring that light. We can do that in solidarity. We can make inclusion accessible, actionable, and aligned. Accessible for everyone. Actionable meaning it's unambiguously prioritized. Something you do, you're in action around because it's prioritized. And that means when you're doing something, you've prioritized it, and it means you're doing it. That sounds circular, but that's what I mean. If you're doing something, you're prioritizing it. and you're putting it into action. And then third, that inclusion is aligned with organizational mission and purpose from people through and beyond profitability. I hope this was helpful. Make it a great day. Peace. If you are committed or simply a little bit curious about how to make DEI accessible to everyone, actionable, that is, unambiguously prioritized and sustainable, aligned with personal and organizational purpose, hit the subscribe button. Make it a great day. Peace.